Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where you will get to listen to some of the best short stories ever written. As a youth, Neil Gaiman fell in love with Avram's stories. Philip K. Dick adored him. Ursula Le Guin thought his tales wonderful, and Ray Bradbury compared him to Kipling. Each episode will include a special guest, an amazing short story, and a discussion of that story. Enjoy classic tales such as O'er All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, The Sources of the Nile, and many others.
How could you be? It sounds like a story to me, yeah. Sounds like a story to me.
Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of the Avram Davidson universe. I'm really excited to have Ted White, who is a Hugo Award-winning author. He's a music critic. He was assistant editor of S and SF. He worked with Avram there for a time, and from 1968 to 1978, he was editor of Amazing Stories and Fantastic. Today, we're going to be listening to Or the Grasses Grow, which was published in November 1958 in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And finally, one thing I'm not going to do today is I'm not going to decide who should play the characters, if this were a movie or not. This is an incredible story. It's one that I feel like I would need some assistance in terms of if I were to ever have this made, or if people requested to ever have it made, I'd want a Native American director, Native American actors, and it's a really special, powerful story. Aside from that, I would love it if you joined the fan club. We have nearly 5,000 downloads now from all over the world, and I know a lot of people aren't signing up for the fan club, so please do so at www.avramdavidson.com. We also have several stories published now. Skinny, Beer, if it isn't already published, will be really soon. December 14th, it'll be out. And aside from that, I'm looking forward to welcoming Ted White. Hey everyone, just wanted to give you a little heads up before this interview. There were a couple of interruptions during my conversation with Ted, and I edited those out. But if you happen to notice a couple of little skips, that's the only reason. And that's it. Enjoy. Looking forward to my conversation with Ted. Ted, great to see you. Great to meet you.
Let's see, I've got something here that says, okay, click that. Good to see you too.
Yeah.
I don't believe we've ever actually met, but of course, we certainly have a number of people in common.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was interesting. Your name was given to me by a fan who said that he thought you'd be a great person to talk to. And he was absolutely right. When I did a little bit of background, I was really excited. And so thank you.
Sure.
So, let's just get started. I gave an introduction already, a little bit about you, but how did you first meet Avram?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not real sure of the answer of when I first met him. I initially must have met him at a convention. And I've been thinking about it, and I think it was probably the 1959 Worldcon in Detroit, just by putting that together with other chronological factors. But I already knew of Avram, and probably Avram already knew of me, because Avram had become quite involved in active fandom, science fiction fanzines. He was contributing letters of comment to them. And in fact, in one poll in 1959, he was voted best new fan. So we were certainly aware of each other before we met. And I, of course, knew of him as an author who had appeared in F and SF primarily. I didn't know much about him. My first really distinct memory of my dealings with him occurred in the early fall after that 59 Worldcon. I was walking some street in Greenwich Village. I lived in Greenwich Village then. I had moved to New York City in 1959, and I lived on Christian Street in the village. And I was just walking down some village street one afternoon, and I encountered him. And I recognized him because I had already met him. And I greeted him, and I was full of news because I had just that day made my first professional sale, which was the Playboy magazine, and I was kind of up in the air about it. And Avram was extremely friendly and affable when we met on the street, and very encouraging and supportive, and it was a very friendly meeting, more so than you might have expected with a casual acquaintance. And that to me was a clue to who and what Avram was as a person. Now, subsequent to that, I saw a good deal more of him socially. I think it was in 1961, I opened a small shop in Greenwich Village, a Mimeo shop. It was in what had formerly been a basement restaurant on 10th Street, just off of 7th Avenue. And I at that time was trying to make my living as a professional jazz critic, and the money was not very great. So I was even then, I was into what is now called the gig economy. So we do all kinds of other stuff as one shots at income. And I had been a professional mimeographer in Washington, D.C., and I was very accomplished with mimeograph machines. And I initially opened this place with the hope that I could get a lot of business doing like daily menus for local restaurants, things like that, commercial stuff. But as it turned out, having a couple of desks and 3 or 4 typewriters and all the other epiphenomena that go with having a mimeo operation, my shop naturally attracted fellow fans. One of them was Terry Carr, who had moved to New York City at my suggestion after his first marriage ended. He lived in Berkeley, California. And he was working in a library, and I told him that he really should come to New York City and pursue a professional career as a writer, which I knew he could do. And he did. So he used to hang out in my shop, which we called Towner Hall. That was not the name by which the shop was professionally known, but it's what the fans called it. And the Towner comes from Francis Towner Laney, a well-known fan of the 40s. And Avram would drop by our shop. I wouldn't say weekly, but probably weekly, maybe close to weekly. I mean, maybe a couple of times in one week and none in the next. But I mean, it was whenever he was in the general area, and he was in the village a fair amount then, he would just drop by and socialize for a half an hour or an hour and just hang out with anybody who was there. And it was in I guess the summer of that year when he walked in, and he was beaming with fresh news. And he had just come from the offices of F&S up on 53rd Street, East 53rd. And he had just been made the new editor. And we were the very first people with whom he shared that news.
Wow.
Terry Carr was there then, and Terry almost immediately pulled out 3 short stories. I mean, really short, none of them over 3,000 words, and immediately pressed them on Avram, saying, "Please read these when you get a chance." So Avram sat down then and there and read all 3, and announced that he would buy all three, actively launching Terry's professional career as a science fiction writer or fantasy writer, as the case may be. So that's a good example of the way in which Avram interacted with all of us.
Would you say, one of the things I read in an article that you had written at one point was something to the effect of that Avram befriended you. Was he more accessible, would you say, than most at that time? I mean,
among professionals?
Yeah.
He was at one end of a spectrum. He was probably the friendliest of all the professionals, not just to me, but in general. He was very unassuming. He never put on airs. He never acted like he was somebody special, And you could talk to him and you could pry all kinds of interesting facts out of him. He not only just knew a lot, but he had lived a lot.
Mm-hmm.
He who told me what a short arm inspection was in the Army, because he'd been a medic, I think, in Korea.
In World War II.
Well, he gave me the impression it was Korea, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
The short arm inspection is an inspection for genital infections. That's where I learned that. There were a number of other professionals who had previously been fans and therefore were not hostile to friendships with fans. But Avram became a fan, I thought, after he became a professional. Only later did I find out he'd been a fan decades earlier in Yonkers,
Mm-hmm.
But he got along well with people then, he had his quirkiness, but he was amiable about it.
And then fast forward a little, you ended up getting a job at FNSF. How did that happen? Well,
again, it was because of Avram. By then, Avram had been living in Manhattan at the upper end of Central Park, just on the west side of it. Like, where does that park end? 100 and something Street. At any rate, he had a ground floor apartment that was almost like you went into this dark tunnel to get to it. But it was in the manner of some New York City apartments at that time, rather large rooms, high ceilings. And that's where he was living when Grania started living with him, and then they got married. And after she had their son,
Yep.
They moved out of New York City. They moved to Milford, Pennsylvania, the same town where Damon Knight had this rather almost mansion, a former hunting lodge. And Jim Blish lived there, and his former wife, Virginia Kidd, lived there, and Judith Merrill lived there. It was a little colony of SF writers and notable SF writers at that. So Avram moved up there to be part of that. Well, not just to be part of that, but he moved up there. And he had parties, and he invited people like me from New York City. And on one occasion, I went up there taking with me both my live-in girlfriend at the time, a woman named Sandy Bethke, and a friend of mine who lived in Brooklyn named Les Gerber. And at the party, Les asked Avram about a story that he had sent to FNSF, which he had gotten back almost immediately in the mail. If he mailed it on a Monday, he got it back on a Wednesday, something like that. It was astonishingly fast. And he asked Avram how Avram had seen and rejected it so quickly. And Avram said, well, no, I hadn't seen it. That was being handled by a slush pile reader. But we were having problems with that reader because he was just taking the manuscripts outside the office on East 53rd Street, inserting rejection slips into everything and dumping them into the mailbox on the corner. So he wasn't reading anything. So they had let him go. They had just let him go. I mean, all of this had transpired the previous week or two. And I turned to Avram, having listened to all this, and said, gee, Avram, do you think that's something I could do? And Avram looked at me for a moment and said, sure, Ted, I think you could. Why not? And that's how I got the job with FNSF, which initially I was, I believe, an assistant editor. Subsequently, I became an associate editor. I'm not sure what the distinction was, but I did do a lot more than slush pile reading. I did blurbing and book reviews, and actually contributed one or two editorials at Avram's request. And that's how I got into FNSF, where I was for 5 years.
Wow. Now, I read some stories about some of the interesting stories that came into the slush fund, and it was something like for every, maybe I have this wrong, but for every 600 stories you'd have to kind of look through, there might be one diamond in the rough. And I was just curious if there were any in there that particularly memorable, or anybody's career that was kind of launched, or anyone that you rejected that ultimately became someone amazing.
All of the above. Well, yeah. I once at one point, 2 or 3 years in, did a statistical analysis and figured that I was seeing roughly 600 manuscripts a month, out of which I went in weekly to pick up manuscripts and turn in anything I was passing on for Avram to read. And I typically would pass on anywhere from 2 to 6 stories a week, of which, after a reasonably short period of time, like within my first 6 months, I established that I was having a slush pile story in every issue of FNSF. So out of those 600 slush pile manuscripts in a given month, one was actually getting published. And many years later, I compared those statistics with Gordon Van Gelder, who was a much later editor and publisher of FNSF. And he said the statistics hadn't really changed that much over the years. It was still about that. I don't know. I mean, I saw all kinds of weird stuff in slush pile. There was this woman who sent me, I don't know, something close to a story a week for maybe a month. And they were all dreadful. They were all UFO stories. You know, they were all the aliens are really among us stories, but very poorly written. And her final story had a cover letter that said something to the effect of, if you don't buy this story, I'm not going to send you anymore. And true to her word, she never sent me anymore. Well, but I mean, she probably mailed that off before she'd gotten my first rejections, you know, considering how mails went in those days. And these manuscripts did not go by first class, I don't think. Yeah.
So question for you on this. So you were ultimately became editor of Amazing Stories and Fantastic, and you published some of Avram's stories. I'm curious, what was it like editing Avram's stories?
Oh, well, you know, you catch the errant comma or something like that, but you don't change words. You know, I mean, Avram, for as long as I have been reading him, which was some point in the late 50s, has had exquisite ability with words. And it would never occur to me at any point in my career as an editor to second guess him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I might tell him something like, I don't know whether I find this a very believable premise or something like that. But I never rejected anything he sent me. I was always happy with his submissions. I was always pleased to publish them. And I basically published them as is, which was my general practice. I mean, I felt that if an author required a lot of editorial work, I shouldn't have bought the story in the first place.
Right.
At best, you send it back to the author with suggested changes and see whether he does it. Which some did and some didn't.
Well, I say with that, maybe go into one of Avram's stories and take a listen to Or the Grasses Grow. What do you think?
Okay.
All right.
Or the Grasses Grow. About halfway along the narrow and ill-paved county road between Crosby and Spanish Flats, all dips and hollows shimmering falsely like water in the heat till you get right up close to them, the road to Tickasall Agency branches off. No pretense of concrete or macadam, or even grading, deceives the chance or rare purposeful traveler. Federal, state, and county governments have better things to do with their money. Tickasall pays no taxes, and its handful of residents have only recently, and most grudgingly, been accorded the vote. The sun-baked earth is cracked and riven. A few dirty sheep and a handful of scrub cows share its scanty herbage with an occasional sway-backed horse or stunted burro. Here and there a gaunt automobile rests in the thin shadow of a board shack, and a child, startled doubtless by the smooth sound of a strange motor, runs like a lizard through the dusty wastes to hide. And then to peer. Melon vines, dried past all hope of fruit, lie in patches next to whispery, tindery cornstalks. And in the midst of all this, next to the only spring which never goes dry, are the only painted buildings, the only decent buildings in the area. In the middle of the green lawn is a pole with a flag, and right behind the pole, over the front door, the sign, U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, Tickasall Agency, Office of the Superintendent. There were already a few Indians gathering around that afternoon, the women in cotton print dresses, the men in overalls. There would soon be more. This was scheduled as the last day for the Tickasall Agency and Reservation. Congress had passed a bill. The President had signed it. The Director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs had issued the order. It was supposed to be a great day for the Tickasall Nation. Only the Tickasalls, what was left of them, didn't seem to think so. Not a man or woman of them spoke. Not a child whimpered. Not a dog barked. Before Uncle Foxhead sat a basket with 4 different kinds of clay, and next to the basket was a medicine gourd full of water. The old man rolled the clay between his moistened palms, singing in a low voice. Then he washed his hands and sprinkled them with pollen. Then he took up the prayer sticks, made of juniper. Once there had been juniper trees on the reservation. Once there had been many trees, and painted with the signs of thunder, sun, moon, rain, lightning. There were feathers tied to the sticks. Once there had been birds, too. "O people of the hidden places, oh, take our message to the hidden places, swiftly, swiftly now." The old man chanted, shaking the medicine sticks. "Oh, you swift ones, people with no legs, Take our message to the people with no bodies, swiftly, swiftly now. The old man's skin was like a cracked, worn moccasin. With his turkey claw hand he took up the gourd rattle, shook it, west, south, up, down, east, north. O people of the hollow earth, take our message to the hollow earth. Take our song to our fathers and mothers. Take our cry to the spirit people. Take and go, swiftly, swiftly, now. The snakes rippled across the ground and were gone, one by one. The old man's sister's son helped him back to his sheepskin, spread in the shade, where he half sat, half lay, panting. His great-nephews, Billy Cottonwood and Sam Quarterhorse, were talking together in English. "There was a fellow in my outfit," Cottonwood said, "a fellow from West Virginia, name of Carruthers. Said his grandmother claimed she could charm away warts. So I said my great-uncle claimed he could make snakes. And they all laughed fit to kill and said, 'Chief, when you try a snow job, it turns into a blizzard.' Old Carruthers," he reflected. "We were pretty good buddies. Maybe I'll go to West Virginia and look him up. I could hitch, maybe." Quarterhorse said, "Yeah, you can go to West Virginia, and I can go to L.A. But what about the others? Where are they going to go if Washington refuses to act?" The fond smile of recollection left his cousin's lean, brown face. "I don't know," he said. "I'd be damned and go to hell if I know." And then the old pickup came, rattling and coughing up to the house, and Sam said, "Here's Newton." Newton Quarterhorse, his brother Sam, and Billy Cottonwood were the only 3 Tickasols who had passed the physical and gone into the Army. There weren't a lot of others who were of conscripting age, or any other age for that matter, and those whom TB didn't keep out. Other ailments, active or passive, did. Once there had been trees on the reservation, and birds, and deer, and healthy men. The wash-faded Army suntans had been clean and fresh as always when Newt set out for Crosby, but they were dusty and sweaty now. He took a piece of wet burlap out and removed a few bottles from it. "Open these, Sam, will you, while I wash?" he said. "Cokes for us, strawberry pop for the old people. How's Uncle Foxhead?" Billy grunted. "Playing at making medicine snakes again. Do you suppose if we believed he could? Newt shrugged. "So, well, maybe if the telegrams don't do any good, the snakes will, and I'm damned sure they won't do no worse. That son of a bitch at the Western Union office," he said, looking out over the drought-bitten land. "Sending a smoke signal to the Great White Father again, Sitting Bull, he says, smirking and sneering. I told him, you just take the money and send the wire. They looked at me like coyotes looking at a sick calf." Abruptly he turned away and went to dip his handkerchief in the bucket. Water was hard to come by. The lip of the bottle clicked against one of Uncle Foxhead's few teeth. He drank noisily, then licked his lips. "Today we drink the white man's sweet water," he said. "What will we drink tomorrow?" No one said anything. "I will tell you then," he continued. "Unless the white man relent, we will drink the bitter waters of the hollow places. They are bitter, but they are strong and good." He waved his withered hand in a semicircle. "All this will go," he said. and the fathers and mothers of the people will return and lead us to our old home inside the earth." His sister's son, who had never learned English, nor gone to school, moaned. "Unless the white man relent," said the old man. "They never have," said Cottonwood, in Tickasol. In English he said, "What will he do when he sees that nothing happens tomorrow except that we get kicked the hell out of here?" Newt said, "Die, I suppose. Which might not be a bad idea. For all of us." His brother turned and looked to him. "If you're planning Quarter Horse's last stand, forget about it. There aren't 20 rounds of ammunition on the whole reservation." Billy Cottonwood raised his head. "We could maybe move in with the Apahoya," he suggested. "They're just as dirt poor as we are, but there's more of them, and I guess they'll hold on to their land a while yet." His cousins shook their heads. "Well, not for us." "But the others?" "Look, I spoke to Joe Feathercloud that last time I was at the Apahoya agency. If we give him the truck and the sheep, he'll take care of Uncle Foxhead." Sam Quarterhorse said he supposed that was the best thing. For the old man, I mean. "I made up my mind. I'm going to L.A. and pass for colored." He stopped. They waited till the new, shiny automobile had gone by towards the agency in a cloud of dust. Newt said, "The buzzards are gathering." Then he asked, "How come, Sam?" "Because I'm tired of being an Indian. It has no present and no future. I can't be a white. They won't have me. The best I could hope for would be that they laugh. 'How, Big Chief? Hi, Blanket Bottom. Yeah, I could pass for a Mexican as far as my looks go, only the Mexes won't have me either. But the colored will. And there's millions and millions of them. Whatever price they pay for it, they never have to feel lonely. And they've got a fine, bitter contempt for the whites that I can use a lot of. Pecks, they call them. I don't know where they got the name from, but damn, it sure fits them. They've been pecking away at us for over 100 years. They talked on some more, and all the while the dust never settled in the road. They watched the whole tribe, what there was of it, go by towards the agency, in old trucks, in buckboards, on horses, on foot. After some time they loaded up the pickup and followed. The Indians sat all over the grass in front of the agency, and for once no one bothered to chase them off. They just sat, silent, waiting. A group of men from Crosby and Spanish Flats were talking to the superintendent. There were maps in their hands. The cousins went up to them. The white men looked out of the corners of their eyes, confidence still tempered, but only a bit, by wariness. "Mr. Jenkins," Newt said to one, "most of this is your doing, and you know how I feel about it." "You better not make any trouble, Quarterhorse," said another townsman. Jenkins said, "Let the boy have his say. But I know you'll give me a straight answer. What's going to be done here?" Jenkins was a leathery little man, burnt almost as dark as an Indian. He looked at him, not unkindly, through the spectacles which magnified his blue eyes. "Why, you know, son, there's nothing personal in all this. The land belongs to them that can hold it and use it. It was made to be used. You people have had your chance, Lord knows. Well, no speeches. You see, here on the map, where this here dotted line is, the county is putting through a new road to connect with a new highway the state's going to construct. There'll be a lot of traffic through here, and this agency ought to make a fine motel. And right along here," his blunt finger traced, "there's going to be the main irrigation canal. There'll be branches all through the reservation. I reckon we can raise some mighty fine alfalfa, fatten some mighty fine cattle. I always thought, son, you'd be good with stock if you had some good stock to work with, not these worthless scrubs. If you want a job—" One of the men cleared his sinus cavities with an ugly sound and spat. "Are you out of your mind, Jenk? We've been working for years to get these Indians out of here, and you're trying to make 'em stay?" The superintendent was a tall, fat, soft man with a loose smile. He said, ingratiatingly, "Mr. Jenkins realizes, as I'm sure you do too, Mr. Waldo, that the policy of the United States government is, and always has been, except for the unfortunate period when John Collier was in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Man may have meant well, but Lord, hopeless sentimentalist. Well, our policy has always been, prepare the Indian to join the general community, get him off the reservation, turn the tribal lands over to the individual. And it's been done with other tribes, and now finally it's being done with this one." He beamed. Newt gritted his teeth. Then he said, "And the result was always the same. As soon as the tribal lands were given to the individual red man, they damn quick passed into the hand of the individual white man. That's what's happened with other tribes, and now finally it's being done with this one. Don't you know, Mr. Scott, that we can't adapt ourselves to the system of individual land ownership, that we just aren't strong enough by ourselves to hold on to real estate, that—" "Root hog or die," said Mr. Waldo. "Are men hogs?" Newt cried. Waldo said at large, "Told you he's a troublemaker." Then, bringing his long, rough, red face next to Newt's, he said, "Listen, Indian. You and all your stinking relatives are through. If Jenkins is damn fool enough to hire you, that's his lookout. But if he don't, you better stay far, far away. Because nobody likes you. Nobody wants you, and now that the government in Washington is finally come to their senses, nobody is going to protect you. You and your mangy cows and your smutty-nosed sheep and your blankets." Newt's face showed his feelings. But before he could voice them, Billy Cottonwood broke in. "Mr. Scott," he said, "we sent a telegram to Washington, asking to halt the breakup of the reservation." Scott smiled his sucral smile. "Well, that's your privilege as a citizen." Cottonwood spoke on. He mentioned the provisions of the bill passed by Congress, authorizing the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to liquidate, at his discretion, all reservations including less than 100 residents, and to divide the land among them. "Mr. Scott, when the Treaty of Juniper Butte was made between the United States and the Chickasaws," Cottonwood said, "there were thousands of us. That treaty was to be kept as long as the sun shall rise or the grasses grow. The government pledged itself to send us doctors. It didn't, and we died like flies. It pledged to send us seed and cattle. It sent us no seed, and we had to eat the few hundred head of stockyard cast-offs they did send us to keep from starving. The government was to keep our land safe for us forever, in a sacred trust, and in every generation they've taken away more and more. Mr. Scott, Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Waldo, and all you other gentlemen, you knew, didn't you? When you were kind enough to loan us money, or rather to give us credit at the stores when this drought started, you knew that this bill was up before Congress, didn't you?" No one answered him. "You knew that it would pass, and that turning our lands over to us wouldn't mean a darned thing, didn't you? That we already owed so much money that our creditors would take all our land? Mr. Scott, how can the government let this happen to us? It made a treaty with us to keep our lands safe for us as long as the sun rises or the grasses grow. Has the sun stopped rising? Has the grass stopped growing? We believed in you. We kept our part of the treaty. Mr. Scott, won't you wire Washington? Won't you other gentlemen do the same to stop this thing that's being done to us? It's almost 100 years now since we made treaty, and we've always hoped. Now we've only got till midnight to hope. Unless... But the superintendent said no, he couldn't do that. And Jenkins shook his head and said sorry. It was really all for the best. Waldo shrugged, produced a packet of legal papers. "I've been deputized to serve all these," he said, "soon's the land's all passed over to individual ownership, which is 12 p.m. tonight. But if you give me your word, whatever that's worth, not to make no trouble, why, guess it can wait till morning. You go back to your shacks and I'll be round come morning. We'll sleep over with Scott for tonight." Sam Quarterhorse said, "We won't make any trouble. No. Not much use in that. But we'll wait right here. It's still possible we'll hear from Washington before midnight." The superintendent's house was quite comfortable. Logs, cut by Indian labor from the last of the reservation's trees, blazed in the big fireplace, built by Indian labor. A wealth of rugs, woven by Indians in the agency school, decorated walls and floor. The card game had been on for some time when they heard the first woman start to wail. Waldo looked up nervously. Jenkins glanced at the clock. 12 midnight, he said. "Well, that's it. All over but the details. Took almost 100 years, but it'll be worth it." Another woman took up the keening. It swelled to a chorus of heartbreak, then died away. Waldo picked up his cards, then put them down again. An old man's voice had begun to chant. Someone took it up. Then another. Drums joined it, and rattles. Scott said, "That was old Foxhead who started that just now. They're singing the death song. They'll go on till morning." Waldo swore. Then he laughed. "Let 'em," he said. "It's their last morning." Jenkins woke up first. Waldo stirred to wakefulness as he heard the other dressing. "What time is it?" he asked. "Don't know," Jenkins said, "but it feels to me like getting up time. You hear them go just a while back? No? Don't know how you could miss it. Singing got real loud. Seemed like a whole lot of new voices joined in. Then they all got up and moved off. Wonder where they went. I'm going to have a look around outside." He switched on his flashlight and left the house. In another minute, Waldo joined him, knocking on Scott's door as he passed. The ashes of the fire still smoldered, making a dull red glow. It was very cold. Jenkins said, "Look here, Waldo. Look." Waldo followed the flashlight's beam, said he didn't see anything. "It's the grass. It was green last night. It's all dead and brown now. Look at it." Waldo shivered. "Makes no difference. We'll get it green again. The land's ours now." Scott joined them, his overcoat hugging his ears. "Why is it so cold?" he asked. "What's happened to the clock? Who was tinkering with the clock? It's past 8 by the clock. It ought to be light by now. Where did all the Tickasols go to? What's happening?" There's something in the air. I don't like the feel of it. I'm sorry I ever agreed to work with you, no matter what you paid me." Waldo said roughly, nervously, "Shut up. Some damned Indians sneaked in and must have fiddled with the clock. Hell with them. Government's on our side now. Soon's it's daylight, we'll clear 'em all out of here for good." Shivering in the bitter cold, uneasy for reasons they only dimly perceived, the three white men huddled together alone in the dark by the dying fire and waited for the sun to rise. And waited, and waited, and waited.
To me, it was written at a time when stories like that might have been hard to publish. And I know for Avram, I was looking at some of the articles he'd previously written, and I think it was a subject that was actually very important to him. The idea of both, if you look at the necessity of his condition, racial rights, the idea of Native American rights. I think he spent some time on reservations. Some of the details that he had in there, I think, were very striking.
Yeah, that's true.
And then he also fought in World War, or was a medic in World War II, and he talked a lot about, with letters from a lot of the Southern folks that he had to deal with during World War II, how, there were a lot of racist, prejudicial issues going on within the Army, and he was pushing with others for segregation, or for no longer having segregation. So I think it was a subject that was actually really near and dear to him at a time when other science fiction writers in the 50s probably weren't writing about those subjects. So
I wouldn't argue with any of that.
Yeah. I mean, I love it. In terms of going back to, I guess, some more Avram stories, one of the authors that has struck me a lot, he's written a lot of forewords for Avram's books, is Peter Beagle. And he writes in them. He would just sit down with Avram and say, "Avram, Don Avram, just tell us things." And I feel like saying to you, Don, Ted, just tell us a couple stories about Avram that really jump out at you, that are funny, or just tell us things.
Well, there are a lot. Let me digress for a moment by telling you about the Hydra Club. The Hydra Club was founded in the very early 50s by a group of New York professionals that included Harry Harrison, who I believe considered himself its founder. I'm not sure whether he was. But by the late 50s, I moved to New York in 59, and in the late 50s, the Hydra Club had lost most of its initial luster. There had been some fierce infighting between Harrison and A.J. Budgers, for example, that created ongoing enmity between the two of them that I was involved in many years after that, in the late 60s. But the Hydra Club had a party in 1960 in late August, before the 1960 World Convention, which was in Pittsburgh. And a lot of West Coast authors like Poul Anderson were in New York City, having hit New York City, I guess, on their way to Pittsburgh, but also because they could do business with editors there and stuff like that. And so the Hydra Club threw this party, which I went to. And subsequently, I wrote about it in a fanzine called Lighthouse, which at that point was being edited by a fellow named Pete Graham, but subsequently Terry Carr would become its co-editor. But the issue with my piece on the Hydra Club, which was called Hydra Country, was solely edited by Pete. Terry was not yet in New York City. And I said some things in that piece which were true, but not kind. Primarily about Judy Merrill, whom I had developed dislike for upon meeting her. I mean, I had no opinions about her one way or the other before then. I mean, I'd read her stuff, of which there was not a lot. And after that fanzine piece had appeared, Avram and Jim Blish invited me to a lunch in a fairly nice restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. And their purpose there was essentially that of Dutch uncles. And they kindly but firmly told me why I should not have written that piece. And I would say that Blish was more stern and Avram was more conciliatory, which is typical of the personalities of both. I mean, I liked them both. I at that point, and as far as I know from there on, I got along well with both of them. But it was a revealing moment to me. It was one of those occasions when someone said to me, "Just because it's true, Ted, you don't have to say it." First person to say that to me was an assistant principal in my high school. But Avram functioned well as a Dutch uncle. Avram was fully capable of calling me on anything he thought needed to be called on. Mm-hmm. And I always respected him for that. And his advice was usually solid and real. And, you know, had I heeded it more than I did, I would probably have been better off for it. I mean, I was a bit of what they used to call a stormy petrel then. I was always involved in controversies of one sort or another. And many of them, Avram was on my side. You know, it wasn't all just me being a fool. No, so, you know, I was one of the few people that Avram knew in New York City who had a car.
Right.
Sure, I was useful to him on that basis. I mean, as I've told you separately, I drove your mother, Grania, up to Milford on one occasion early on, back when they were still living in New York City. And there was a reason why she had to go up there. And we bonded on that trip. I mean, we had really long conversations, like a 3-hour trip each way, something like that. And that's when I really got to know her. I didn't know her really before that, just as somebody who was Avram's girlfriend, you know. And that's when we became friends, really, you know. So I did a lot of transportation. And I never begrudged it. I always look forward to those trips with him, you know, just a chance to catch up and talk with him about stuff. He was always a delight to talk to.
Yeah, a lot of interesting things to say. You know, you brought up one thing that I always like to talk about, which is Avram tended to leave things everywhere. So I've heard from so many people saying, "Oh, you know what? I still think I have X, Y, and Z in my storage locker, or I still have this." And a lot of the manuscripts that I've had to put together are from other folks who've been kind enough to send me the copies of manuscripts that they still had. You know, I'm looking for one in particular that I'm still looking for, which was Avram's Bailey's travel journal, and I'm still missing the first. He did a rewrite, and I have a first draft, but I'm still looking for the first 18 pages of his manuscript, Dragons in the Trees. And I'm saying it for two reasons. One, because it's just so ironic how we would leave things everywhere. And two, if someone happens to see this and happens to have those first 18 pages, boy, would I love to have them.
Yeah, he moved around a lot.
Yeah.
And at one point he was in residence in a university here in Virginia, And that's the last time I saw him, is he came up and visited me one afternoon. And it was just a very pleasant time. He was using a cane by then.
So that would have been in the late, that would have been in the 70s then. So you haven't seen him for
yeah, this would have been in the 70s or even early 80s. I'm not sure exactly when, but
did you ever, after that, did you write letters? Did you stay in touch? Did you talk on the phone, or was that kind of it?
that was kind of it. I mean, our correspondence tended to be perfunctory business correspondence, like loved your story, I'm buying it, that kind of correspondence, rather than anything personal or ongoing. We did not have ongoing correspondence. Now, I don't know whether I should regret that or not. It just, Avram was one of those people that I valued his presence, and I didn't think too much about him when he wasn't present.
Mm-hmm.
By that point, we both were living pretty busy lives.
Yeah. Well, I want to say this was amazing. I can't thank you enough. Is there any last things you'd like to say? Is there an encapsulation of Avram in a nutshell that you'd want to let the world know, or just any last things?
Well, I would characterize the man as avuncular. And that's how he always struck me. I mean, he was always at least a generation older than me. And I always looked up to him. I mean, I never regarded us as equals. I always regarded him as my superior, as a writer and as a human being, both. I was aware that he had his moments of pettiness, but then so do we all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a human aspect. When I think of Avram, I always smile.
That's nice.
That, to me, he was a man well worth knowing.